we're already dealing with a controversy amongst these early believers. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, what laws the Gentiles converts would keep as opposed to Jewish converts. Now you've got the non-believing, these are Orthodox Jews. I mean, Jerusalem, it was Jewish. The people were Jews. These are Orthodox, Mosaic Jews, keeping the laws of Moses, and they're angry with Paul. So in we're now in verse 36, and then in verse 37, as the soldiers were about to take Paul into their own barracks, their own place, into the soldiers, this isn't actually prison, this is just to put him into their own safekeeping, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" Right, what's the answer? And the answer from the Roman is, "Do you speak Greek?" You have to understand that although the Romans are here, the main language in the New Testament of this time was Greek. And that's why the whole New Testament was originally written in Greek. And so the officer is saying, "Do you speak Greek?" And then in verse 38, the Roman officer, not understanding what the Jews were arguing about, not having understood because of the noise and the chaos, and it said he couldn't understand, he says something very unusual. In verse 38, he turns to Paul and he says, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" So this commanding officer does not understand the position. And he's questioning as to whether Paul is somebody else, an Egyptian terrorist who led 4,000 people up, probably that they died in the desert. And in verse 30, Paul now gives a very, very clear answer. And he says, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia." Tarsus, that's now in modern Turkey. Yes, I've been there. I used to have breakfast in Tarsus on my journey through. So he gives the actual facts, you see, that I'm a Jew, and of course he's of the highest level, having studied under Gamaliel. He's a Pharisee, and Paul, under Jewish law, before his conversion, was one of the strictest. And he says, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia." A citizen of no ordinary city. Tarsus was a very important city in those days. A place, a very center of Jewish study and culture. Although it was in Turkey, it was a strong place of Jewish study. That's why Gamaliel was there. So he says, Paul says, "That's my background. Please let me speak to the people." And I find it so interesting here, because this poor Roman soldier, Roman officer, then gave permission. And Paul stood on the steps and called to the crowd. And for once, Paul, he's still got chains on. He's under the protection of the Roman officer and the soldiers, and he's got permission to speak. And he turns to the people, and they were silent. And he said to them in Aramaic. It's very interesting because you've got three languages here. And it's very interesting that he spoke to the Jews in what was the early Jewish language, Aramaic. Whereas that would mean, in all probability, that the Roman officer would not understand exactly what Paul was saying. The commanding officer had questioned, do you speak Greek? I don't know what Paul's answer was, but I believe he did, because of his study. Now, he also knows Aramaic, the Jewish language, and says in chapter 22 at the beginning, brothers and fathers. So he's speaking to the elders. Listen now to my defense. And then he says in verse 2, when they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, not Greek or Roman, they became quiet because they understood that if he spoke in Aramaic, he must be a Jew. And in verse 2, it goes on to say, Paul said, verse 3, I am a Jew. I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, Jerusalem. Although, no, I believe he was actually brought up in Tarsus. But anyway, he was born in Tarsus. But he did come to Jerusalem. And then he puts in as his defense, under Gamaliel, I was thoroughly trained in the law of our fathers and was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. Now, this is very significant because his defense is that he's every bit as much of a Jew as his persecutors, his tormentors. And he says in verse 4, I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women, throwing them into prison, as also the high priest and all the council can testify. You know, Paul has an absolutely incredible, remarkable testimony, because his testimony is his background. As you know, Paul was converted on the road to Damascus, but until that moment, he was a Jew of the highest order. And he says here, I even obtained letters from these people, from the high priest and the council. I obtained letters from them to their brothers in Damascus, that's to the Orthodox Jews, and went there to bring these new converts, believers in Jesus, as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. So in actual fact, Paul was doing something that these rioters, these Orthodox Jews are trying to do to him. He, in actual fact, his testimony is, I was in the same place that you are now, because I did exactly to these new believers in Damascus and in Jerusalem what you are trying to do to me.